Hey friends, are you ready? Welcome back to the episode 6 of our weekly videos. Enjoy!
Hi, how are you? How's your day going? Are you like me? That asks like a lot of questions but can't seem to find the answer to? Don't worry, have faith. Because we're from the Surrey, Filipino Seventh-day Adventist Church Children's Ministries. We're together with loving Christians. We learn to love Christ and love like Christ. And we have answers.
Jesus ever mad?
Was Jesus ever mad? Absolutely. Just like us, Jesus got mad. But it's important to understand why. Let's look at, 4 examples of when Jesus got mad. Story number 1. You may be familiar with this story. All these parents are bringing their kids to Jesus. They have Jesus touching their children's heads and blessing these children, and Jesus sitting amongst all these kids, and the disciples get upset. They're like, no, we can't have these kids around here. You're bothering the master, they're saying. And then Jesus gets upset with the disciples and says, no, let the little children come to me. For such is the kingdom of heaven. He does chastise the disciples for what they did. So the question is, why did he get mad? Jesus got mad because the disciples were separating the most vulnerable people from him. You see, sin separates us from God, and if the disciples were going to also put this extra wedge of class or status between Jesus and these children, well, Jesus didn't like that. That was an injustice, and Jesus was not going to let that stand. Because even the youngest children should be able to come to Jesus. Another time Jesus was upset. So, it's Sabbath. Everyone's going to the temple. And a man shows up with a shriveled up hand. And Jesus sees the man. He calls the man up. Makes sure that everyone can see. And he heals the man's hand in front of everyone at church. Everyone's like, whoa. Oh my goodness. Jesus healed this man. But the Pharisees are angry. How could he heal this man on the Sabbath? Sabbath is, of course, a day of rest. And Jesus is upset with the Pharisees. How dare they try to block this blessing from this guy, from this person who's receiving a blessing on the Sabbath, because they believe that this is in some way in violation of the Sabbath? Jesus responds to them by saying, is it better to give life on the Sabbath, or if you were to kill somebody on the Sabbath? Again, Jesus is upset because of the injustice of somebody trying to separate honest to goodness people from God. Another time Jesus gets upset. There's a man with leprosy who comes to Jesus, and Jesus heals him. Before he heals him, when he sees the leprosy, Jesus gets angry. Why? Well, many scholars would agree that the reason why Jesus was upset was because he witnessed what sin does to a person. Sin, again, these lepers felt like they were separated from everyone. The lepers felt that they were not worthy of much. And Jesus there going off and saying, I am available. I love you. And he's upset that sin separates us from God. The final example of Jesus getting upset is at the temple. There's the famous story where he flips tables and he takes out a whip and he chases out the moneylenders. And what upsets Jesus? He says, for this temple is supposed to be a house of prayer, and you have turned it into a den of thieves. This is people taking advantage of other people. And not just taking advantage of other people, but doing it in the house of God. So of course, again, Jesus is upset. The Bible never tells us that being angry is evil. Instead, in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, it says, in your anger, do not sin, and do not let the sun go down on your anger. So it's how you handle your anger. We are asked to be able to control our emotions, rather than just letting them lead us to just do whatever. And Jesus shows this in his stories as well. Anger is an emotion fueled by an injustice. You are upset because something seems unfair, and our world can oftentimes be unfair. It's important for us to understand what our anger is fueled by, and understand if this is something that we need to take a stand for, or how we can actually process it in a way that's constructive. So, talk to your parents about that. Talk to your church members about that. What do we do when we're angry? And use the example of Christ. Look for when there is an injustice, and don't feel bad when you feel upset. Just understand where it's coming from. Thank you.
Why is Jesus not getting sick?
Okay, great question. Why didn't Jesus get sick? And the answer I can give you, basically, is, well, we don't know that Jesus didn't get sick. Right? He was fully God, he was fully man. Which means if you're a human, you're susceptible to illness, right? However, the gospel writers didn't feel like that was an important thing to write about. However, and if that's not what you're implying, perhaps your question is, Jesus was around sick people a lot. There's lots of stories of Jesus going into a town and everybody being healed. And I'm sure a lot of those people had contagious illnesses. Perfect example is leprosy. He puts his hand on a leper. And that's something that, well, shocked everyone around Jesus. Because leprosy was extremely contagious. So contagious that they put lepers outside of the city. And while we know that Jesus never got leprosy, at least from the stories we've read, we have to assume that there must be a reason why. I think it's logical to assume that when Jesus touched a leper, it was a miraculous, supernatural action. And so he wouldn't get sick from that. But when it came to just your everyday life, I don't think Jesus was necessarily immune to all pathogens. That's just kind of how I read it. There doesn't seem to be any other evidence in the Bible about this, so we kind of just have to go by that type of speculation. Good question. And so the main answer is, why did Jesus not get sick? We don't know. Thank you, though.
Happy Sabbath, everyone. Why does Jesus only have male disciples?
Okay, so your question was, why didn't Jesus have any female disciples? Or why were all of Jesus' disciples male? First answer to that, they were not. Now, I'll get to what you're thinking, because I'm pretty sure you're talking about the 12, but let's just go in general. In Luke chapter 10, verse 1, we learned that there were 70 plus disciples. Depending on your translation, there could be 72 or 70 disciples that Jesus sent out. Okay? And he sends them out 2 by 2 after appointing them to do great works. That's a lot more than just 12. And I would say it's unlikely that they were all male. Now, the Bible doesn't say that, so, okay, let's put my hands up. That doesn't prove that they were female disciples. Then we get characters like Mary Magdalene. We get Joanna. Joanna, if you don't remember Joanna, she worked in Herod's court and was a follower of Jesus. And we get Salome, several different female figures in the New Testament who are directly connected to Jesus, who are learning from Jesus. And that is what a disciple is. Disciple simply means a student. Now you might be like, okay, so there were women around Jesus. That doesn't prove that there were female disciples. Well, that is what a disciple is. And they are in the discipleship. They would have been following Jesus. But let's talk about the 12. Why 12 male disciples? Well, because what Jesus was doing with the 12 disciples was to represent, well, that Jesus was doing a new thing. Okay? In the Old Testament, in Genesis, we learn about the 12 tribes of Israel. And now, in the New Testament, we are getting the 12 disciples. The same way those 12 tribes were to start a new nation of priests is the same way that these 12 disciples were supposed to set up a new faith, a new community of, well, like a royal priesthood, dare I say. So that's why there were 12 male disciples. They were analogs to the 12 tribes of Israel, or the 12 children of Jacob. So that's what was going on there. But that doesn't mean there were only 12 disciples. There were multiple disciples. Some of them were women. And if you really want to keep pushing it, we can go to the apostles. There was an apostle named Junia. And she, being a female, was also appointed as a follower of God, of Jesus, more specifically. So, ladies out there, don't ever feel like you can't be a follower of Jesus just because you're a woman.
Why didn't Jesus marry?
So your question is, why didn't Jesus get married? That one is a fun one. So, here's the deal. We know that Christ didn't get married, or we assume that Christ didn't get married because the Bible says nothing about it. That would be a big thing for the Bible to add in there. In fact, Jesus goes to a wedding feast, but there's never any reference to his own marriage. That would have probably come up. We know Peter was married. We learn about several of the disciples' families. Nothing about Jesus getting married. Cool. We continue on and we realize that Jesus does talk about, or the Bible does talk about, the bride of Christ. And when Christ tells stories, he talks about coming as a bridegroom to his wife. Well, then who is the wife of Christ? Who is this bride of Christ? The church. And I know it's weird. You're thinking, wait, what do you mean? When Jesus talks about the church being his bride, he is talking about how just like a husband has a duty to their wife, so does Christ have a duty to the church. Just as back in those days, a husband would take the wife and bring them to, whether it was the father's house or whatever the new home was going to be, so will Christ take us, the church, with him to the new heaven, the new earth, all that type of stuff. So, who was Christ's wife? The church. Was there a literal female woman that was Jesus' wife? No. And why was that the case? Well, there's a lot of reasons. But the one that I kind of settle on is there wasn't really a reason for him to get married. He knew what his mission was, and his mission did not involve having a wife and kids. He was going to come here, live a life like a human being, and die. And I don't think he wanted to bring someone else into that. But that's my speculation at that point. You can continue reading about this in many different books, but if you go strictly from what the scripture says, this is just not brought up. Paul himself, Paul the Apostle, would take the same idea, and he also would never get married. For some people, the mission, the word, the actual duty of following the Great Commission from Jesus is what they're married to, as opposed to actually literally getting married. So, great question, and thank you.